Okay, let's do a full review and breakdown of the greatest American film ever made, The Shining. If you're familiar with me, you know I like to do deep dives on certain topics, and I suppose this will be one of them. So get ready. Hopefully you're a fan of The Shining. If not, by the end of this review, I hope you will be. I'm going to discuss the film, I'm going to discuss the book, and I'm going to discuss some literature that predates both. So, go ahead, and if you have the time, I'll suggest that if you have not already seen the film, you watch it. If you have not already read the book by Stephen King, that you read that book as well. The other material I can provide you. So let's get started. So why is The Shining the greatest American film ever made? Now this is subjective, of course. I'm not going to be discussing things like special effects or money or popularity, although it definitely could be argued that certain effects are very important to this film. I'm not going to get into that particular aspect of the film. There are a lot of videos about The Shining, the film, and although quite a few of them are pretty good, in my opinion, a number of them are not. And so I would suggest, of course, that you check out some of the series that's put together by Mr. Rob Ager and Collative Learning, if you so desire. I do suggest you watch the film before you watch what I'm going to be discussing. It'll help the discussion. And if you are so inclined that you read the book, The Shining, of course, by Mr. Stephen King. I'm going to be discussing all those things, and I also want to discuss a few things prior to that in this video. I want to have a full and extensive discussion, not just of the film, and not just of the people in the film and the writers and producers of the film, but I also want to discuss the previous literature, which includes, of course, Mr. Stephen King's book, The Shining, and himself. And I also want to discuss Edgar Allan Poe, and that is something that I seek to do in this introductory video. Now, before I really get going, I guess I should discuss what I mean by the greatest American film ever made. What do I mean by American? So that, I guess, is the first thing. First off, by American, I mean the United States of America, of course, although American can be a term that can be applied to anyone from the Americas. So, in particular, what I mean is that this is something that's made from an American point of view, and it involves specifically American themes or things that are important to the United States of America. And third, it should have a message for Americans, or it should have a message about Americans to other people. In that way, it's ingrained within the national fiber of this country, and that makes it American. Now, what do I mean by great? And I should point out, by the way, that this film was largely made in England, actually, but it was, of course, put together by Kubrick. And the introductory material that fed most of this is American. So although you could argue that since it was mostly made in England, it's a British film, I suppose, I would disagree. Let's consider now what I mean by greatest. First off, it needs to be interesting, of course, and that's a very subjective measure. For me, interesting means that it is pretty heavy in the inclusion of symbolism, art, philosophy, those types of things. And it's, I guess you would say, subterranean. It's subconsciously imbued in the film, and you pick up on it as you watch it, and you recognize that that is happening, but you don't totally understand it right away. The second aspect of being a great film, in my opinion, is that it has to tackle many themes, macro and micro ideas, from the individual to the family to the nation. It needs to deal with religious topics, economic topics, political topics, all those things. The more of them, the better. Although it doesn't have to extensively deal with each one of them, it should at least have portions of them that are tied together into the plot of the film. A third measure of greatness, in my opinion, is like any other art form. It needs to incorporate the soul of the artists and writers that are involved. And the way that you measure this is by looking for little pieces of those people in the film. It's kind of hard to describe, but I suspect this is kind of what Van Gogh meant when he said you could look at a painting and you could feel the soul of it. And in the same way, you can look at a film and you can kind of feel the soul of it if it has soul to it. And the easiest way to kind of figure that out is by seeing whether or not the people that are involved with it are fully involved with the film, whether or not they've taken little pieces of themselves and put it into that work of art. And the final thing that I'll say makes a great film is that it needs to make an effective change to the viewer or provide some form of revelation, some new way of looking at something, some new way of considering something that's important. In doing so, it provides value to that individual and in many ways to society as a whole. I very much believe that this film does that. So, I did just do a kind of a, I guess you could say, a sympathy for the devil kind of introduction. So in a way that was an introduction. In a way I was just kind of joking around, having fun, because it seemed like a fun thing to do at the time. But if you want to watch that video, I'll link it. It'll be in the description. What I really want to do here is I want to discuss Edgar Allan Poe. And the reason I want to discuss Edgar Allan Poe is because, of course, the film is based on Stephen King's book. And Stephen King's book, in the very introduction of the book, cites a specific paragraph of the Masque of the Red Death. Now, I'm not going to just do that, because I'm not going to just do that single paragraph. I'm going to read you the entirety of the Masque of the Red Death. And the reason for that is because there is very likely a reason that Stephen King has pointed to this story as an influence on his book. And in order to understand the book, we need to understand this story. And if we understand those two things, then we can understand a little bit more about the film, probably. So this isn't under copyright anymore, which is great. So I can just give you the words as I read through them, and you'll have to be patient. When I come across things that correlate, if I come across anything that correlates to this to this story, I'm going to go ahead and flash things on the screen, and I will discuss them later. Or I'll just throw up some kind of words, I guess, to explain what my thought is. So, the Masque of the Red Death. Let's get started. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in, though this wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a mass ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. An imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon the closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple, and its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire, that projected its rays through the tinted glass, and so glaringly illumined the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures which, unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet. And then for a moment all is still and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away, and they have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy sensation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall, gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that at the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its rôle, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment, with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber, in which stood the Prince Prospero, as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room, where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberately and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, which none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterward, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of the revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Okay, well, thanks for sticking through all that. That was quite a long read, and I'll apologize for some of the mistakes that I made in there. I mispronounced some things, and I misread some things, and I realized that because I'm making this portion now, the second half of this video, after I've already kind of put together the video and edited everything for the first half. So with the benefit of hindsight, I know there's some mistakes in there. At any rate, I do think it's worthwhile to go through all that, because in the end of this video I want to kind of discuss some of the themes that go through that, and I also will do a breakdown of some of the symbols from the film that seem to correlate in my mind to that short story. I guess I shouldn't call it a poem, I should call it a short story. Before I do that, though, I want to discuss Mr. Edgar Allan Poe himself, and this is something I like to do, is to kind of break down people as much as we can. Of course, it's very, very difficult to know specifics about a person's personality and other issues or aspects of them, but it is possible to know events in their lives, and you can also kind of know what actions that they took during the course of their life, and you can make assumptions about people based on their actions and the things that they've done in order to kind of create a I guess you could call it like an outline of what may be within their art. And to me, Edgar Allan Poe is an artist. Of course, he's a writer, but he's creating art. So let's see if we can find little pieces of Edgar Allan Poe and the things that he's made, little pieces of his history in the things that he's made. And I think you'll find this worthwhile as well. So let's run through some facts of Edgar Allan Poe before we move on. Okay, so Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809. He did not live a very long life. He ended up dying on October 7th, 1849. at the age of 40. He was the second child to two actors. He had an older brother and a younger sister. His parents were named David and Elizabeth, or Eliza Poe. After 1 year after Edgar Allan Poe was born, his dad abandoned the family. And then a year later, his mother died of consumption. Consumption, if you're not aware, is the old term that was used for tuberculosis, a disease which has been largely eradicated in the first world, but continues on in a number of poor nations. And I do not think that modern people recognize the danger of tuberculosis. The extreme prevalence and difficulty in life that was caused by tuberculosis. It's very it's a pervasive and wildly dangerous disease, and it's I don't know, I'm going off topic here, but it's in danger of coming back because of the failure of antibiotics. So at any rate, people have a lot of things to worry about. One of the things that I worry about is the return of consumption on a large scale, which makes the story Masque of the Red Death perhaps make a little bit more sense to people already if you recognize that at the age of 2 years old, Edgar Allan Poe lost his mother to consumption, and we'll see other things happen here with him as well. At any rate, he was taken in by a wealthy merchant and his wife, John and Frances Allan. That's how he got the Allan portion of his name, Edgar Allan Poe, although he was never formally adopted. In 1812, he was baptized as an Episcopalian. This may or may not matter to some folks, but I'll point out something interesting here in a little bit regarding that religion. And we have to recognize that there is going to be a religious aspect of this discussion because so many people are influenced by their Judeo-Christian belief sets that are established within their religion. So let's continue on. In 1815, he went to school in the UK. His family moved over there. Apparently his foster father was originally from the UK. He spent time in Scotland and in England, in Irvine and in Chelsea, respectively. And he spent about a year in each area going to school. In 1825, his adopted father inherited about $750,000. This was a vast sum of money in 1825. It's difficult, really, to know around. I don't know exactly what that would be in today's dollars. I saw a figure that was like double-digit millions or something like that. So quite a bit of money that was inherited by his foster father. Now, around 1826, Edgar Allan Poe may have become engaged to a young lady named Sarah Elmira Royster, and I guess they were sweethearts at a young age. He went to the University of Virginia to study languages, and the University of Virginia at that time was a kind of a radical school, I guess what people would compare Berkeley to now. But basically it was a school that was founded by Thomas Jefferson and was kind of really chaotic. It involved things like students kind of determining what their classes would be, and it was just kind of a mess. Anyway, things started to kind of go bad. Miss Royster married another man. Edgar Allan Poe accrued a number of gambling debts, apparently, and ended up leaving the school. And although his foster father did help him with some money to cover these needs, you have to wonder at that point how stable a person Mr. Poe is. And this will continue on during the course of his life. In 1827, he ended up enlisting. His foster mother died, although he didn't know that apparently right away that she was sick and dying. He did attend her funeral, I believe, the day after she had passed, and ended up kind of reconciling with his foster father in the short term, at any rate. He was appointed to West Point, U.S. Military Academy, and he released his first collection of works in Tamerlane and other poems. I'm not going to go into everything that Mr. Poe has released because I'm not doing like a full bio of him, and I don't want to get too sidetracked with all these kind of side topics. I want to concentrate on the Masque of the Red Death and the Shining, so I'm just going to go through here and kind of cherry pick details that may explain aspects of him that are in the Masque of the Red Death. Okay, in 1830, Allen, who was Poe's foster father, ended up marrying a second wife. He disowned Poe at that time, and Poe ended up deliberately getting himself court-martialed, and he ended up leaving West Point. Now, we should point out that this is a double failure now on Mr. Poe's part. He has failed in his enlistment, and he has failed in his court-martial from West Point. And perhaps I shouldn't call them failures, but I will say that they are not seeing things through to the end. The reason for his court-martial is noteworthy. He was court-martialed for not attending formations, classes, or church. Okay? And the reason I'm going to point this out is the church portion, because you would think that if someone wanted to get court-martialed, there's no reason not to go to church. The other things, if they're devout in their belief set. Correct? You can let me know what you think in the comments, but in my opinion, if someone is devout, they'll still go to church. If they're devout and they want to get court-martialed, you could still do that just by not going to classes and formation. But to avoid church, it seems a little bit odd to me. Okay, in 1831, in New York, Poe released his poems, which was a collection, and that collection was partially paid for by other cadets that he knew, which I think is kind of cool. In 1831, his older brother died. He had health problems and was an alcoholic, apparently. At that time, Poe was continuing to write, although he was struggling with this. He was actually fired from a job for being drunk on the job, so he also is showing signs of struggling with alcoholism. In 1835, he got a marriage license to marry Virginia Clem, who was his cousin. At that time, she was 13 years old. I won't go into that too much. People did marry younger and they did die younger at that time, so maybe that's not too strange. I will point out that, these dates are like 1835. This is not long after the War of 1812, where the U.S. fought against the UK, and not long after the Revolution. So, this is a very, very different time. Although, it's really less than 200 years ago. It seems like, often to me, it seems like reading these things is like reading about things from the Middle Ages, but it's very easy to underestimate the change that's occurred in just the last 200 years. Okay, and let's continue on. In 1836, they were married in a Presbyterian ceremony. Okay, now that's not a big deal to some people, but I just want to point out that he was already baptized in another Protestant faith, so he has just changed faith. I'm assuming because that is what Virginia Clem's faith was, that she was Presbyterian. I don't know that, but I'm just assuming that that's the reason why. The only thing that I will make an assessment of is that it appears that although Edgar Allan Poe is within a Christian construct, he is not a zealot. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but he does not seem to be the driver of religious faith. He appears to be influenced by the religious beliefs of other people, and because he was not attending church while he was at West Point, although that was not necessary to get court-martialed, he apparently did that, it makes it look like he was simply doing that to be compliant. Let's continue on. In 1842, in January of 1842, Virginia Clems showed the first signs of tuberculosis or consumption. Apparently, she was playing piano and singing, and she began to cough blood. Coughing blood is something that happens when you're sick with tuberculosis. In May of 1842, Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Masque of the Red Death. So I want you to recognize the correlation there. In the very beginning of the poem we just read, there is a specific call out to blood and disease, and tuberculosis and consumption are tied to a destructive disease that is associated with blood. In 1845, and I don't know, I don't want to talk about consumption too much. In 1845, Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Raven. This was a wildly popular poem, and it basically made him famous overnight. He was paid the grand total, get ready for this, he was paid the grand sum of $9 for that poem. $9. I mean, it just blows me away to think that he would write this poem and only be paid $9 for this amazing creation that he made. Now, in this review, I found something that was somewhat eye-opening to me. Apparently, someone had visited with the Poes while they were in Fordham, New York, and one of the visitors commented on Virginia Clems' hair, and she's whoever this visitor was specifically said her raven hair. I guess this is a Myers, and there's something called Raising the Wind, a book about Poe, and I thought, wow, that's very interesting that this visitor would note her very pale skin and her raven black hair. And it occurred to me now, while I was putting this together, that the reason why the raven may be tormenting Edgar Allan Poe is because of the black hair of his wife. So he is assuming that there's a correlation between the raven and his wife who is dying. And that is the source of the torment within that poem. I've heard a lot of people talk about, what is the source of the torment within the poem. That's the question, is that ravens typically are viewed as messengers. And because of the color of the raven and his wife's hair, he may have made that correlation. I find that interesting. And anecdotally, I will say that ravens are my favorite birds. When I was young, I went out bird hunting with a bird tagger, and we caught one bird, and it was a crow or a raven. I don't know. I was 5 or 6 years old at the time. The bird seemed very large to me, and I had to hold the bird while the tagger was tagging its leg, and it seemed, very strong. So I suspect it was only a crow because I was so small, but it may have been a raven. I don't know. And I also have a very strong attraction to women with black hair. I don't know what's going on there, but perhaps I'm just putting myself into that story and I'm thinking that that's what Edgar Allan Poe is doing, but it seems to make sense that if there's a visitor there that's commenting on her raven hair, they may have been repeating something that was already kind of in the air or being discussed amongst the group later. Who knows? Perhaps that's backdating information. I don't know. At any rate, in 1847, Virginia died. After that, there is some, there's some kind of scandalous things going on before that between Edgar Allan Poe and other ladies. And I don't want to read too much into it because it is possible that Virginia may have been kind of like pushing him to do so. And the reason for that is, of course, they had not had children. And she may have known she was dying. And so and I mean, people react to things differently, but it may seem odd to some people that someone who's kind of leaving the world would be pushing other people to move on without them. But in a way, I think that's a very humane thing to do, to tell them, it's okay to continue living on without me. And perhaps Poe was not doing well, and we know that he wasn't doing well because he was showing some signs of, I don't know, some of the visitors were commenting on his condition being pretty bad, and they were referring to things like brain or cranial inflammation, I don't know, headaches, I'm assuming, but I mean that can be related to a lot of other health issues. Anyway, eventually he returns to Richmond and resumes some form of relations with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster. In 1849, he was found semi-conscious, and there's kind of a large mystery about the nature of his passing. He may have died from being an alcoholic, which I would argue definitely exacerbated whatever happened, because alcoholism can cause so many other problems. He may have been suffering from some form of ED. He may have had cholera. He did utter a few things before he passed. Apparently he would only repeat the name Reynolds, and eventually he said, "Lord, help my soul," which indicates a bit of remorse, perhaps, or perhaps a desire to have lived a more religious life than he did. I don't know. I don't want to read too much into it. So that's the history of Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, kind of lined factually by dates and occurrences within his life, and I'll just kind of point out a few of them. One is the constant presence of disease, and in particular consumption and alcoholism. And of course, disease figures in the Masque of the Red Death. I have not finished the book The Shining yet, and so the second video that I'll put out after this will be a while away still. But I know from the film, and so should you, that alcohol figures pretty significantly in the film. I know enough, I've read about halfway through the book already, that alcoholism figures quite strongly in the book. So two things that very likely were significant problems for Edgar Allan Poe, let's say, they do figure in this kind of timeline between The Masque of the Red Death all the way through the film The Shining. Okay, so let's go back now to the video. Now let's consider what some of the meanings might be behind all these kind of symbols for all these different word groups that I just kind of threw at you really quickly in this video. And we'll start at the very beginning, and I'm just going to I'm trying to get back to the beginning here. Okay, so let's go ahead then and just kind of do our breakdown of some of the symbols that are tied to the poem itself, and we'll consider them. In the very first section is stated that the Red Death had devastated the country, and they call it specifically a pestilence. They tie it to blood as its avatar and the redness and the horror of blood. So now we know that very likely for Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, this is tied to consumption and the display of blood, or the blood in a person's cough, and the danger of it. Now, there is specific mention made of country and blood, and these symbols are within the film quite significantly. There are a lot of American flags in the film. I'm not going to fully discuss the film yet, but we have to recognize that there is a sickness being tied to a country, and there are very, very old stories. Amongst them are kind of this old tradition that sickness within the country ties within sickness within the king. And this, of course, ties in with the story of King Arthur and the Holy Grail. So, if you're familiar with that story at all, the sickness of King Arthur is kind of tied to this blight that's taken over the land that he rules. So, in the same way, the film may be doing the same thing, and that may be the reason why they have chosen to represent the country with an icon that looks very similar to the Kennedys. Okay, so let's continue on to the next portion here. Very specifically, there is a ghost or a dream or whatever you want to call it in the film that looks like a man with blood on his face, which is very similar to a Masque of the Red Death. I will just kind of note here really quickly that this progression of disease is described as being very fast, and the termination of the disease is about 30 minutes, which is very, very fast. The nature of that time frame is suspicious. And the reason it's suspicious is not like how it ties in with the book, but later on in the film, that quickness of destruction, that speed of destruction, very easily lends itself to the idea of atomic war, nuclear warfare. That would be something that would destroy people in a very fast period of time. And there are a lot of, let's say, symbols that are used within this film that other people have chosen to believe are tied to the idea of perhaps a fake space landing and Room 237 and everything else. I would argue that it is possible, and we'll see more of this as I continue on with this discussion, that the rocket symbols that are being used in this film are specifically discussing the nature of destruction being tied to a very, very fast death that is far-ranging and affects many people. A genocide, an Armageddon of sorts. Okay, let's continue on. So this would explain then the hedge. And if you look at the hedge that surrounds the maze, you can see missiles that are kind of, they look kind of like diamond shapes. Anytime you deal with this, people will kind of see different things. Some people say, well, that's just a phallic symbol or something. But taken in totality, with the theme of the film and the theme of the book of destruction and total destruction, the easiest correlation to make, the simplest correlation, which is often the correct one, is that this is a warning about nuclear war. Okay, and I will explain towards the end here why I've included the elevator. At the end, I'll show you something that will kind of confirm this. Okay, so let's move on then. The next portion oddly discusses this prince. So Prince Prospero, who Edgar Allan Poe specifically states was happy and dauntless and sagacious, reminds me quite a bit of Kennedy. The nature of Kennedy. And part of the reason that I brought up the myth of King Arthur is because the correlation itself was made by Jacqueline Kennedy in a quote about Camelot, where she says something like, there will be other great presidents, but there will never be another Camelot. So that's a bit of an odd statement, but we have to recognize in the minds of the boomers who were active at that time frame, many of them, the Kennedys, represented something really fantastic and wonderful, and it was destroyed and lost, like Camelot was lost. So the choice of Kennedy representing a prince, if so chosen, would seem to make sense in their eyes. So let's continue on. it's a little bit odd, isn't it, to you, that Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious, even though there was this really, even though his dominions are half depopulated, and this Red Death is kind of running through his land. It's a bit odd, don't you think? So, at any rate, he pulls in all these people to have this big party, and enter the seclusion of his court. Now, the poem or the short story goes on to state that this is, a really great, amazing structure, extensive structure, and of course the Overlook Hotel is a pretty amazing and magnificent structure. And the story states that a strong and lofty wall girdled it in. Of course, there isn't really a strong and lofty wall with gates of iron, but there is a maze outside that kind of has that wall feel to it. And also there is the isolation of the land itself, which is kind of pointed out in the very beginning of the film. There also are the elements of snow and cold that isolate this Overlook Hotel. So although there are not gates of iron, there are other gates that are keeping everything kind of tied in within this Overlook Hotel. Okay, the next section kind of mentions that there's no means of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within, which, I mean, is pretty accurate. That's basically what happens to the character Wendy. She's kind of trapped in this place with someone that's going crazy. The next portion mentions that it is amply stocked, and of course that's the whole review at Dick Halloran's character. He shows them around the kitchen and shows them all this amazing food and drinks that have been set aside so that they have more than enough to last. And of course, continuing on, I shouldn't really mess too much with the film. I don't want to mess with it too much. I just want to show direct correlations with the book. But this would be exactly what someone would do if they wanted to survive a nuclear war. They would stock up on things and live in their bunker. And so it's kind of funny that this feels like a bunker in a lot of ways. There were a lot of appliances of pleasure, and there was wine. And of course, in the film, there is wine and alcohol, although it's imagined, apparently, by Jack Torrance. It's not innately in there, and I know from reading the book that they specifically state that there is no alcohol. And in the book, Mr. Torrance is kind of he's on the wagon. He's avoiding alcohol because he's had problems with it in his past. Let's continue on. Now we get to kind of one of the more interesting thoughts that are quite significant to the film. And that is that there are 7 rooms here of this structure, which is an imperial suite. And I'll point out, of course, the number 7 is within the number 237, which is in the film. In the book, it's room 217, but in the film, it's room 237. So here we have a reason for the room 237, and I'll finish this thought before we finish this story. We will identify why the room 237 is chosen and why it is colored in the way and upholstered in the way that it is. The apartments were not regularly disposed, and of course, the words that are being utilized here, the apartments were so irregularly disposed that vision embraced but little more than one at a time, and sharp turns 20-30 yards. This sounds very much like a maze, and now we may have a reason why Kubrick added a maze, because in the book there is no maze in the book, but it is described here in the words of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I'm reading too much into this poem, and we don't know that Mr. Kubrick and Miss Johnson were doing this. But in a little bit, I will show you exactly what I mean. that they definitely had read this, and they definitely did include details from the story in the film. Okay, so the novel effect description is specifically shown when Danny's writing his little trike around the overlook. It's extremely creepy because of the unknown. He's constantly turning corners very quickly. The layout is disorienting. The color changes are disorienting, often disgusting, and he's doing so quickly, and it's unnerving because you really don't know what to expect around the next corner. The layout is deliberately confusing. Okay, so the next portion I want to discuss specifically shows us why the room 237 is chosen instead of 217. And it also explains or shows that definitely Mr. Kubrick and Ms. Johnson had read this short story and included aspects of it into the film. The story goes through each room in turn. It starts with a blue room, and then it goes to a second chamber, which is purple, and then a third chamber, which was green. It ends with a seventh chamber, which has black curtains. Now, if you go through those numbers, 2, 3, and 7, green, purple, and black, those are the exact colors that are in room 237. So they have just, and I'll give you just, what are the chances that those three things line up? So first you have to do the numbers. 237, that's what, 1 in 10 by 1 in 10 by 1 in 10. So that's 1 in 1,000. And then go through the primary colors, which is like 9, including black and white. So that's already 1 in 1,000, and then you're basically doing that again. 1 in a million. So the chances that lines up randomly are so low that we have to recognize that Kubrick and Johnson are very likely deliberately pointing to the colors of the Masque of the Red Death, and that's why they're included in this room. There are other colors in this room, like pink, that are used, but I'll discuss that when we get to the film. Okay, let's continue on to the next item of interest. Now, that for me, that was important because I never understood why are these weird colors all being put in room 237. Is it just to be sickly? They do look sickly. I mean, they don't really match, and perhaps that's the reason why they chose purple, green, and black. I really don't think so, and I'll get into that when we discuss the book, because there's a story behind this room that's in the book and the lady that's in the room. So that explains kind of why those colors were chosen, I suspect. At any rate, let's continue on. Next, the short story kind of discusses the production of a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances that are tied to these braziers of fire and the lighting. And of course, these braziers of fire and lighting are very important. They often crown the characters, and the use of them, I'm not really clear on. I mean, I don't know if they're good things or bad things. I'll look at them a little bit more as we get to the film. But for right now, let's just note that the use of lighting to produce all these weird appearances is mentioned here. And it's not specifically called out as like this crowning effect, but it is discussing the effect on faces and the effect on people. Okay, so the next portion that I would like to discuss is the gigantic clock of ebony. Perhaps this is a good place to do it. Well, I'll start the topic anyway. The gigantic clock of ebony reminds me of the elevator. The elevators look like clocks to me. Perhaps that's just me, and the colors, because they're kind of black and red. There does appear to be dials up above them, which some people say these look like faces or eyes. For me, they look like the possible halves of a clock. And I'll just kind of throw in here that this kind of clock theme that's outlined within this poem is carried on to not only this elevator, but very likely the doomsday clock of nuclear war, which looks very similar, by the way. to the eyes or the floor designations above the elevators. I just want to point that out. And yes, the doomsday clock has been active for a very long time. I believe they started it in like 1947. Anyway, I'll put the date up here when I get to editing this video. Okay. There is a mention of brazen lungs of the clock. There came a sound which was clear and loud and disconcerting for everyone involved. It was peculiarly menacing, and the sound of this film is extraordinary, but they do definitely catch that. And there is there is a disturbing likeness here, which is the story of the bronze bull, which may be happening, I don't know. But the bellowing of the bull when people were kind of boiled in this bowl, that's an old story, and I do wonder if that's kind of being referenced here in the poem, but indirectly, through the idea of the brazen lungs. Okay, let's continue on. The next portion that I think is interesting is this idea that there's light laughter and everyone's just kind of having a good time, even though they know something's really, really wrong, which is what we all do in the face of catastrophe to some degree. But these people have completely separated themselves from the nature of that catastrophe. And we have to start to ask, you know, why are they doing that, and what are the implications? And I guess I'll try to get into that a little bit more a bit later on. But the moral question that everyone should ask is, what is our natural inclination to pain and suffering? Do we seek to exclude ourselves from that even though other people are experiencing it? Or do we try to immerse ourselves in it to lessen the suffering of others at risk to ourselves? I mean, that's a really personal kind of an idea, but we mentioned that Mr. Edgar Allan Poe was a Christian of some sort, and I have to ask the question, you know, what kind of a Christian is he really? And why is he drawing this separation, this idea of separation of classes or separation of people out within his... Why is that so horrifying? This is obviously a story that is meant to relay horror. Well, there is something horrifying in that, in the idea that people will continue on with life as normal, even though they know that everyone else is dying. At any rate, when you see Torrance kind of walking through this party, that makes me consider the nature of that. And there is a story, of course, in the Bible of something similar to this, which is, of course, the story of Noah. And that is a story that has bothered me for a long time. As I mentioned before, I do consider myself a Christian, though I'm not dogmatic and I'm not tied to any specific delineation of Christianity. I will say that the story of Noah is one of the three stories that I consider to be pivotal in the development, maybe four, I don't know, 3 or 4 stories that are really important. One of them is the story of Noah, because within that story is the idea of helping other people. Why are some people to be destroyed and others not? Who has the right to pass judgment on these people? Obviously, different people have different answers to that question. But the idea that you're going to separate yourself from other people, in the story of Noah, it's presented, of course, that he tries to warn them that this is happening, but nobody listens. So in that way, it's morally justified. In the Masque of the Red Death, there is no justification that's given. Simply that the Prince Prospero has pulled together his court, or his favorites, and they have retreated away from the Masque of the Red Death, even though they know that things are bad outside, which indicates an amorality in Prince Prospero. Okay, so let's continue on. Just my interpretation. You can choose to go follow along with that or not. It's up to you. Okay, The next portion that I'd like to discuss, or the next symbol that I showed you, was that Prospero's plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. Okay, so there are a number of statements there that tie in with the idea of being lit, glowing, firing, and barbaric. And so many of these that are tied to the Prince Prospero. And I'll just point out really quickly that he's a prince. He's not a king. So he's referred to as a prince and as a duke. And a duke is someone that's in line to the throne, but a prince is the primary. And as a Christian, the traditional Christian story of the fall of, let's call him Lucifer, is that he was the primary and he fell. So I do wonder if there isn't some kind of correlation being made within this story to the fall of what most Christians would call Satan, or if there isn't something else going on, or simply an allusion being made to it. At any rate, there is a direct Christian reference at the end of this. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. To be sure that he was not mad, basically. So that right there is a specific Christian reference, because that is something that happens with Thomas. That Thomas wants to touch the risen Christ to make sure that he's real. And if you want to point at these two things and say I'm reading too much into it, that's fine. You can hit me with your comments or whatever else. But there is an allusion that's being made here, in my opinion, that is consistent. And it's that's three things now. You know, the use of the prince and the duke, the idea that he's bold and fiery and has barbaric luster, and that people need to hear and see and touch. We will see more references to religion within this short story, and they may be incorporated in the film. Of course, you can see Torrance, Mr. Jack Torrance, and other people constantly lit with this lighting. And of course, a number of the candles look like crowns, which is a bit disturbing. And I haven't gone through the entire film yet, obviously, but I do not often see Danny under crowns. He's often under these lights that are just singular lights. I don't know if there's something going on there or not. I'll have to think about it. Okay, so one of the next things that's kind of mentioned is that the prince had directed that there would be these movable embellishments of the seven chambers. And many people have recognized that there are moves happening behind the scenes of the film. The one that I've included is this moving chair in the background. And Mr. Rob Ager has a full discussion on the dopey symbol in Danny's room, which he correlates to being a message of sorts. But this one with the chair in the background I learned about from the Wendy Theory video. I'll link Mr. Ager's video, and I'll link the Wendy Theory video. But that definitely is happening, and if you want to believe that's an accident or just a mistake, I mean, that's totally up to you. But these movable elements are in the film, and they are specifically called out here in this short story. Let's continue on. There was much of the beautiful, the next portion of the poem that I want to look at. Much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of which might have excited disgust. These are accurate descriptors for a lot of the weird stuff that's happening amongst the dreams. So the first one is, of course, the weird dog man or bear man, together with what looks like a president. If you believe in the idea of this being a nuclear kind of a missile thing, the implication there is obvious. You have a businessman and a bear, which could easily be a representation of the United States and the Soviets at the time, although this later would be the United States and Russia. The next image is, of course, Jack being kind of seduced by this old hag that looks beautiful but turns into an old hag. So much of the wanton, much of the beautiful, something terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. That's all captured within the film. One of the creepiest scenes to me is of course the old lady in the bathtub. And there is a mention here: the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And that's kind of what happens with Jack Torrance as he leaves room 237. This old woman is kind of hackling at him and laughing at him as he departs. Okay, so here now, specifically, I'll mention the blackness of the sable drapery, how it's appalling in room 237, and how it's mentioned here specifically in the most westerly room, that the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and nobody wants to be in that room anymore. Okay, let's continue on. The next portion that I kind of want to take a look at here is this idea of the other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And this is one of the really cool sound effects that's in the film The Shining, is this heartbeat kind of a sound that's in a number of scenes. Now, I don't know who put together all the music and sound for this, but he did a great job. And there is a video on that, and I'll link it, where someone actually breaks down all the things that are being done acoustically in the film. I'm not going to go into them too much. I'm just going to mention that this heartbeat sound is being included to be creepy, and it's mentioned here in the short story as well. Okay, the next portion that I want to discuss is that there's this masked figure again, and people seem to recognize the Mask of the Red Death is there. Now, who actually is the Mask of the Red Death? I don't know. Who is Prince Prospero? There seems to be, in the short story, this kind of antagonism between the two of them. In the film, obviously, that's not really clear. Like, who is Prince Prospero? I'll get into this a little bit later. But if he is directly kind of discussed in the film, who is it? Is it Jack Torrance? Is it Danny Torrance? Is it Wendy? I mean, people have a lot of different theories. I would argue, in my opinion, that pieces of Prince Prospero are placed in each one of these characters, and so they all represent a portion of him, and they're coming to awaken to the existence of the Mask of the Red Death. Okay, so as people kind of recognize what's going on, they're turning to terror, horror, and disgust, and in that portion I kind of show this Wendy Torrance reaction to what she's seeing as she's waking up to the horror that's around her. And I just want to point out that Duvall's acting is absolutely wonderful in this film, and a lot of people have bashed her, and I think that Jack Nicholson and Duvall put together some of the... This is just... Her facial expressions are so wonderful. She so accurately captures the nature of this short story in her demeanor and her facial expressions that, yes, it's nerve-wracking, but man, she really does a great job. And it's a little bit unfortunate that people kind of have attacked her incorrectly, in my opinion, for not being a strong female character. In my opinion, she has done two amazing things in this film. She has portrayed a strong female character, and she has done it in such a wonderful way that people don't even realize that she's done it, which blows me away. At any rate, I'll get into that a little bit more later on. I'll just point out to you, of course, that Diane Johnson was brought on to help write this, and you have to ask yourself why. She's no dunce. It's very easy to overlook secondary people, and it's very easy for people to worship Stanley Kubrick. But he chose to bring her on for some reason, and you would have to think that the reason he would do that, in my opinion, would be to make this character of Wendy Torrance a very complex and strong character, and I believe that they did that. Okay, so let's continue on. Again, I'm kind of getting sidetracked. I keep talking about the film. I'm just supposed to be talking about the short story. Okay, so here is another biblical reference. But the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod. Okay, now Herod, of course, is very prominent in the Bible. And, of course, he is tied to Christianity and the development of Christianity. So that right there is something that is, although not a direct Christian reference, can definitely be understood to be important to Christians. And as we mentioned, Mr. Poe may have been, I don't know, he may have been messing around with Christian ideas for quite a while. Okay. The next portion of the poem kind of mentions this idea of some people being utterly lost and death kind of being a joke. So, of course, what kind of people are utterly lost and life and death are just jokes? In my opinion, those are people that are quite often nihilists. They are people that have gone off the deep end of meaning, and for them, and this is something that I feel Jack Nicholson does very well in the film. He seems to become a nihilist. He seems to be disposed that way in the film. In the book, I know already his character is much more complicated in the book, but in the film, he seems to be predisposed towards nihilism, and I don't know exactly what you would call it, but he is not someone I would call emotionally stable from the beginning. Okay, so the next thing that I kind of want to point out is a very disturbing scene for most people, although you may not recognize it. Okay, so the figure is tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. Okay, so this reminds me of the scene of Jack Torrance meeting with Grady in the bathroom. And one of the reasons this is because of the fact that he's in a tuxedo, which, you know, I guess is appropriate as a server at this very reputable establishment. But also because, if you continue to read it, the mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty. The movement of this man, this Grady man, if you watch his left arm, his movement is incredibly stiff. It is like a corpse. It is unnerving. As a human, we have a natural feel for the way that other humans are supposed to move, and he is not moving in an appropriate way. If you look at his arm, his left arm, as he moves, he is behaving like a stiffened corpse. For some reason, he's kind of making a motion with his hand. I'll get into this a bit more with the film breakdown, but it is unnerving in the way he moves. And often horror films will show unnatural movements as an unnerving method, a means towards generating horror. Again, there's a mention of the face, and I'll just mention his vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow with all the features of the face was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. So many of the characters in this film are dabbled in blood in their vesture, in their clothes, and it's not direct, it's indirect, because they're wearing red clothes. So, of course, the color red can tie in with blood. It's understood to be tied in with blood. Subconsciously, we all recognize that as a possibility. When it happens enough, and it happens throughout the film, you begin to make that correlation that the color red is being deliberately tied to the nature of blood. And, of course, the feature of the man with the blood running down his face is very similar to the Masque of the Red Death. Who he is and why he's there, I have no idea. Okay, so I guess the next thing is the reaction of the convulsion of Prince Prospero upon the spectral image. It kind of mentions that he runs through this series of emotion of being kind of convulsed with fear to suddenly turning to terror, distaste, but in the next his brow is reddened with rage. This emotional instability that is within Prince Prospero, in this case, tie in my opinion, quite well with Jack Torrance or Jack Nicholson's portrayal of him in the film. He runs through all these emotions very quickly. which, I don't know, some people might think are reasonable, and some others would look at and say that's a bit odd for someone who's supposed to be a hero. Again, is the prince good? Is he a good prince? Or is he evil? Is he both? Is that the story here within the film, that he's choosing, that Jack Torrance is choosing between what type of prince to be? Okay, let's continue on. The figure then goes through all the rooms, which of course is something Danny does on his trike. He runs through all the rooms. I've discussed that already. And something that's a little bit odd or doesn't match up is, of course, that Prince Prospero then attacks this mummer, as he's described, with a dagger. But, of course, Jack Torrance isn't using a dagger in the film. He's using an axe, which doesn't correlate with the book either. The only person who's using a knife in the film is, of course, Wendy. She's defending herself and Danny with this knife and running around with it during. So, again, some people say, well, he's just giving people different things. But I don't know what's in the book yet. I haven't got to this point in the book. But it doesn't match. Unless, of course, there are pieces of Prince Prospero in each one of these characters. And perhaps, the character is moving around through each of them during the course of the film. I don't know. Just a thought. Eventually, Prince Prospero dies, and of course, the only person that dies in the film is, Dick Halloran dies, but the only main character that dies is Jack Torrance. So, is he the prince, Is the prince bad? I don't know. And I'll just kind of... Okay, let's continue on. There's a few more things to go through. Again, mention of the ebony clock. There are grave cerements and corpse-like masks referenced, and of course there are corpses in the Overlook, in the form of skeletons, and died. And in the next portion, the revelers are all dropping in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of their fall. Okay, so. This, of course, is very. This reminds me a lot of the two twin girls that are dead in the halls. Right? They die in the halls, and they're in a very strange posture. They're in a despairing posture of their fall. I'll get into their posture, the possible reasons for their posture when I get into the film. And then finally, everything is kind of dead. All the people are gone. One by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of the revel, and died each in the despairing posture of the fall. And the clock, the life of the clock, goes out with the last of the gay. And here I'll show you a picture of the doomsday clock. You can see the shape of it. They only show a quarter of a clock, really, because midnight is kind of all that matters. Which, again, seems to indicate that the film, while not discussing a disease, Armageddon, is discussing the possibility of an actual atomic or nuclear exchange as a form of Armageddon. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the symbols that are in the film that I can tie kind of to the short story, The Masque of the Red Death. It's quite extensive, I think you'll agree. And the cool thing to me is that Mr. Kubrick and quite possibly Miss Johnson worked together to pull these from the short story, The Masque of the Red Death, and throw them into the film, which makes it a really, really wonderful film that's tied in with their, I guess you could say, their life story and their art. I will discuss Kubrick, I will discuss Miss Johnson before I actually start the discussion on the film. And I will discuss Mr. King when I discuss the book, which I plan to do next. So I've discussed some of the themes that I kind of want to eventually get into, such as, what is the nature of that Armageddon? What is the nature of the warning? What is the background of the horror? And I will relay a personal item, which is that I do not like horror films, and I do not watch many of them. I watched this film as a kid, and let's see, how old was I at the time? I probably was like 10, but this film never scared me.
And I've always been perplexed by that. I've always wondered, how is it that I'm so scared by, especially like really gory, nasty horror films, or very religious, twisted kind of, or mentally unstable. And I watched this film as a kid, and I thought, this isn't really scaring me, and I don't understand why. And as I've grown older, I understand now why. Because this is like a nightmare. This movie for me has a message, and that message is one that is intended to help people avoid problems. And I'll get into that a little bit more when I discuss the film. But I think even as a young person, I recognize that this isn't a negative film. This is a film that, if it's understood, and a story that, if it's understood, can be utilized to help people develop. So, I'll finish up with a couple things. One is that I'd like to, in the spirit of caring about fellow man, which is kind of what I think is at the core of this short story, that we recognize that death and destruction of self, and that there will be difficulties in life, are inevitable. But, what do we choose to do? Do we choose to partake in life, or separate ourselves from that and live this kind of strange, depraved life? That's core to this. Obviously, it's within the short story itself. I would like to mention a couple people that I think are fairly wonderful, and I'll mention something else. The first is on February 3rd, 2023, a man named Pete Reed died outside of Bakhmut and in Ukraine. He was a volunteer, he was a paramedic, and a Marine Corps veteran. And he wasn't there fighting. He was there to help people that were injured, and whether they were civilian or military, he was working to help the people of Ukraine. He probably helped Russian soldiers too, for all I know. But it is wonderful to me that that man went over there to help people in spite of what was going on around him. And I think that's an admirable quality in someone that didn't need to be there, but he kind of knew what was happening and wanted to help. So I would like to kind of mention him here. Another person, a friend of mine, just passed away from pancreatic cancer, and he was an artist. And his name was Nevin Faltzgraf, and he has his art is available on Facebook. If you just do a search, you can see his art. His wife wrote a really touching kind of memory on Nevin. And I wasn't close friends with him, but I mean, I did talk with him quite a bit on a few occasions. And he was a very interesting person, and he was, in my opinion, a talented artist, although he didn't really get involved with his art until he got a little bit older. Good and bad in that, right? I mean, there's just lost time, but he did make quite a bit of his time as he got older. And he was someone that was perhaps not a really good friend to me. I mean, he had his faults, like any person does, but he did introduce me to a number of people that are very good friends to me now. A number of them are older, and I think it's valuable for people to have cross-generational friends, so we can kind of see different ways of looking at things. At any rate, he passed away from pancreatic cancer, and he struggled with that for a long time yesterday, so I'd just like to mention him here. And I think it's admirable in artists that they do try to create things and beautify the world, and they do that often without much benefit to themselves, unfortunately. As we mentioned with Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, he was paid the grand total of $9 for his poem, The Raven. And finally, it's a little bit odd to me that we have to consider the possibility of people destroying themselves when there are so many other things. Imagine, it's such a strange thought to me, this idea that someone like Edgar Allan Poe would point to obviously a disease being tied to Armageddon or whatever else, and we consider other things like asteroid strikes on the planet, all these other things. These are all not being caused directly by people, but we have at least one source of destruction that's tied directly to us, that's under our control, and yet it's not under our control for some reason. And of course, recently so many people have died in Turkey in an earthquake, and there are so many people there now that are trying to rescue people that have been stuck. They've immersed themselves in that situation to try and better other people's lives directly, instead of extracting themselves from it and hiding in a bunker somewhere and hoping that the problems of the world will go away and not affect them. I think that's a really beautiful thing in humanity, that there are a lot of people that are still very human and caring. At any rate, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll follow this up here in a little bit with a discussion on the book.